The night along Russia's Black Sea coastline began with an assumption that had hardened over years into doctrine: Novorossiysk was untouchable. As one of Russia's most valuable maritime hubs handling oil exports, military logistics, and civilian shipping, worth an estimated $20 billion annually, the port was treated as a fortress rather than a front line. Cranes stood motionless under floodlights, tankers rested quietly at anchor, and conscript guards rotated through watchposts expecting nothing more dramatic than routine radio checks. The calm itself was deceptive because behind it lay one of the densest air defense networks Moscow had ever assembled outside the capital. At the center of that confidence stood the S-400 system. 12 launchers supported by Pantsir and Tor batteries formed a layered dome designed to repel everything from cruise missiles to aircraft. Russian planners had repeatedly cited Novorossiysk as proof that Western-style precision strikes could be neutralized far from the front lines. In official briefings, the port was described as safer than facilities closer to Ukraine, protected by distance radar coverage, and the Black Sea itself. For NATO analysts watching from Brussels and Washington, it was a textbook example of how Russia intended to shield its economic arteries while sustaining a prolonged war. Yet this sense of security ignored a critical reality of modern conflict: air defense is not just about hardware but about perception, timing, and physics. Radar coverage does not curve with the Earth. Algorithms cannot always distinguish between threats and noise, and defenses optimized for one type of attack can be vulnerable to another. These weaknesses mattered because Novorossiysk was not just a port. It was a keystone in Russia's energy export chain, feeding refineries, pipelines, and maritime routes that underpinned state revenue. Any disruption here carried consequences far beyond the Black Sea, rippling into global energy markets already strained by sanctions and conflict. In Kyiv, Western officials and Ukrainian planners alike had been studying this vulnerability for months. Reports from Reuters and Defense News in late 2025 noted an increasing Ukrainian focus on economic targets, rather than symbolic strikes aiming to degrade Russia's ability to finance prolonged operations. The logic was simple: hitting energy infrastructure could achieve effects that battlefield advances could not. NATO governments, while publicly cautious, quietly acknowledged that such strikes aligned with a broader Western strategy of economic pressure, rather than direct escalation. As midnight approached, Novorossiysk remained unaware that it had already entered a different phase of the war. No sirens sounded. No emergency alerts interrupted the quiet routines along the waterfront. Russian radar screens showed only familiar maritime traffic and the static of a peaceful night. What the operators could not see was already moving far beyond the horizon, exploiting assumptions embedded deep within the defensive doctrine protecting the port. And as the clock edged closer to the moment of impact, a single question loomed over the Black Sea: how long can a fortress remain secure once its defenders believe it is beyond reach? Far from the illuminated docks of Novorossiysk, the operation that would shatter that confidence was already unfolding in near silence. Deep inside Ukrainian-controlled territory near the Black Sea coast, a mobile launch unit stood concealed beneath camouflage netting and winter foliage. According to later assessments cited by Western defense analysts, this mobility was essential. It reduced detection risk and allowed Ukraine to operate beyond the predictable patterns Russian intelligence had come to expect. What mattered most, however, was not where the missiles were launched, but how they were intended to fly. Shortly after midnight, 4 long-range Neptune cruise missiles lifted vertically from their launch canisters in rapid succession. Their initial climb was brief and deliberate, designed to stabilize guidance systems before transitioning into a low-altitude cruise profile. Within seconds, each missile pitched downward toward the Black Sea, leveling off just meters above the water's surface. At roughly 900 kilometers per hour, they were not hypersonic, but speed was never the primary advantage. Invisibility was. Radar physics favors the attacker at low altitude. Because radar waves travel in straight lines, the curvature of the Earth creates blind zones beyond a certain distance. Russian planners knew this in theory, yet doctrine assumed that early warning systems and overlapping coverage would compensate. Ukraine's approach exploited the gap between theory and execution. By flying beneath radar horizons for most of their journey, the Neptune missiles remained effectively invisible until the final moments of their approach. This was not improvisation. Western intelligence officials speaking anonymously to the BBC and the New York Times later described the strike as methodically engineered, combining lessons learned from earlier Ukrainian attacks on Russian infrastructure. The missiles followed pre-programmed sea-skimming routes guided by satellite navigation and terrain-matching data refined over months. Their warheads weighing hundreds of kilograms were chosen not for spectacle, but for their ability to destroy hardened targets with precision. As the missiles crossed hundreds of kilometers of open water, Russian systems remained largely unaware of the true threat. Novorossiysk's air defense network continued operating under the assumption that any attack would be detected early and engaged at range. This assumption shaped every subsequent decision made by Russian operators that night. By the time the Neptune missiles drew close enough to register, reaction windows would shrink to seconds. From a strategic perspective, this phase of the operation underscored a shift in Ukraine's campaign. Rather than seeking battlefield breakthroughs, Kyiv was demonstrating the ability to strike deep into what Moscow considered its strategic rear. For NATO planners observing from afar, the implications were sobering. If a non-NATO military operating under constant pressure could penetrate such defenses, similar systems protecting critical infrastructure elsewhere might also be vulnerable. As the missiles pressed onward, still unseen, the stage was set for the next layer of the operation, one designed not to destroy, but to confuse. And in that confusion lay the opening Ukraine needed to turn invisibility into impact. The first signs of trouble appeared not as missile warnings, but as clutter. Russian radar operators east of Novorossiysk watched their screens fill with unfamiliar returns, small, erratic contacts appearing in clusters where none should exist. At first, the assumption was technical interference or routine aerial noise. Within moments, that assumption collapsed. Dozens of targets multiplied into scores, then into what appeared to be a swarm spreading across multiple altitudes and vectors. Alarms sounded. Procedures kicked in. Crews began classifying contacts as hostile. What they were seeing were not cruise missiles, they were decoys. Ukraine had launched a coordinated wave of unmanned aerial vehicles directly into the detection lobes of the S-400 supporting radar network. These drones were inexpensive compared to interceptors, but they were purpose-built for confusion. Their radar signatures were inconsistent, their flight paths deliberately unstable, and their numbers sufficient to overload prioritization algorithms. To automated systems and human operators alike, the picture became chaotic. Targets appeared, disappeared, and reappeared just long enough to demand attention. Russian doctrine emphasizes engaging the most visible threats first. That doctrine now worked against its own defenders. Pantsir and Tor systems opened fire, followed by launches from higher-tier interceptors. Bright trails streaked into the night sky as missiles chased drone signatures that cost a fraction of their price. From rooftops around the port, the scene looked like a successful defense, explosions blossoming high above targets seemingly destroyed one after another. But success was an illusion. Every interceptor fired at a drone was one not available for the real strike. Every radar cycle spent tracking decoys was a moment lost to what mattered. According to later analysis by Defense News and Western military experts, this was a textbook example of saturation warfare, forcing advanced defenses to exhaust themselves against cheap threats, while high-value weapons pass unnoticed below. Beneath this aerial chaos, the Neptune missiles continued their approach, hugging the sea surface so closely that they blended into background clutter. Radar theory became operational reality. The Earth's curvature blocked detection until the missiles were dangerously close to shore. By the time their silhouettes briefly appeared on Russian screens, reaction time had collapsed from minutes to seconds. This phase of the attack highlighted a deeper issue for Moscow and a warning for NATO. Air defense systems are often evaluated in isolation, tested against single vectors or limited salvos. Ukraine demonstrated that effectiveness depends on integration under stress. When multiple layers are forced to respond simultaneously to false and real threats, even the most advanced systems can fracture. Strategically, the drone swarm served another purpose as well: psychological pressure. Russian operators were compelled to act quickly, firing to prove the system was working, reinforcing confidence upward in the command chain. Yet that very response blinded them to the quieter, deadlier threats slipping through the gaps. As interceptors detonated harmlessly in the upper air, the real weapons closed the final distance. And with every second of confusion, the window for stopping them narrowed to almost nothing. The moment the illusion of control collapsed came without warning. As the decoy drones continued to draw fire overhead, 2 Neptune missiles crossed the coastline and briefly climbed just enough to acquire their terminal targets. This short ascent was not a flaw. but a feature allowing their infrared seekers to scan inland for heat signatures that matched preloaded profiles. Within seconds, the software identified what Ukrainian planners had prioritized above all else: the eyes and brain of Novorossiysk's defense network. The first target was an S-400 battery positioned on elevated terrain overlooking the port. From the missile's perspective, the site glowed unmistakably: generator units radiating heat, radar arrays pulsing with electrical activity, launcher tubes still warm from recent firings. There was no human decision at this stage. The seeker confirmed the match, corrected its trajectory, and committed. Moments later, the missile plunged into the center of the battery. The explosion was immediate and catastrophic. The engagement radar was torn from its mount, fragments scattering across the hillside. A split second later, secondary detonations rippled through stored interceptors, amplifying the blast. Flames surged skyward, briefly illuminating the surrounding area brighter than daylight. Cameras from nearby facilities captured the shockwave rolling outward, a visible signal that something fundamental had failed. The second Neptune struck another battery seconds later. Again, the missile targeted command and power elements rather than launchers alone, ensuring that even surviving hardware would be rendered useless. By the time Russian crews understood what was happening, the network had already lost coherence. Launchers that remained physically intact were suddenly blind and deaf, unable to receive targeting data or coordinate with neighboring units. This was the decisive break. The defensive dome protecting Novorossiysk did not collapse gradually, it fractured all at once. Analysts later cited by Military Watch magazine described the effect as network decapitation, a tactic increasingly emphasized in Western and Ukrainian doctrine. Destroy the sensors and the shooters become irrelevant. For NATO observers, the implications were immediate. The S-400 had long been marketed as a system capable of denying access to entire regions. Here, it was neutralized in minutes by a combination of deception physics and precision. The economic value of the destroyed equipment, hundreds of millions of dollars, was significant, but the strategic cost was greater. A cornerstone of Russia's deterrence narrative had been visibly dismantled. As Russian interceptors continued streaking uselessly into the sky, the remaining Neptune missiles pressed forward into airspace that was now effectively undefended. The port below, still lit and operating under emergency confusion, lay exposed. And with the shield gone, the operation entered its most destructive phase, one aimed not at symbols, but at the economic heart of the facility. What followed would ensure that the damage extended far beyond the burning hillside into markets, supply chains, and strategic calculations across the Black Sea region. With Novorossiysk's long-range defenses effectively blinded, the final phase of the strike unfolded with devastating clarity. The third Neptune missile adjusted course toward the Shishkaras oil terminal, a critical node in Russia's Black Sea energy network. From above, the terminal presented an unmistakable thermal landscape: circular storage tanks radiating residual heat, pipelines tracing glowing lines across the ground, and pumping stations standing out as compact, intensely hot rectangles. These were not symbolic targets. They were the mechanisms that kept fuel moving. As the missile closed in, it climbed slightly, then executed a steep dive aimed directly at the terminal's main pumping manifold. The detonation ripped through the control hub, sending shockwaves through interconnected pipelines. Electrical systems failed instantly. According to early assessments later echoed by Reuters and DW, automated safety protocols attempted to engage, but were interrupted by physical destruction of control nodes. Fire spread through the facility not as a surface blaze, but as a pressure-fed inferno moving through the infrastructure itself. Seconds later, the fourth Neptune struck a nearby storage tank. Its infrared seeker had locked onto the dense heat signature of stored fuel, and the impact produced a fireball visible across the bay. Flames reflected off the water like a second sunrise, captured on video by civilian sailors and port workers. The scale of the explosion left little doubt this was a direct hit on Russia's export capacity, not a warning shot. With air defenses still preoccupied by lingering drone activity, a second wave of Ukrainian unmanned systems entered the area. These were no longer decoys. Smaller UAVs targeted auxiliary systems, power substations, internal logistics yards, and backup control centers. Some confirmed damage, others assessed the spread of fire in real time. One drone strike reportedly disabled an energy control hub responsible for emergency shutdown procedures, compounding the chaos created by the missile impacts. By dawn, large sections of the port were engulfed. Tank yards burned intermittently, cranes stood silhouetted against columns of smoke, and operations were suspended indefinitely. Russian authorities declared a state of emergency while the Ministry of Defense emphasized the number of drones intercepted rather than the infrastructure lost. Independent reporting suggested injuries among civilian crews and damage to at least one commercial vessel from debris and overpressure. The economic implications were immediate. Novorossiysk handles a significant share of Russia's maritime energy exports, and even a temporary shutdown disrupted shipping schedules and insurance assessments. Energy analysts cited by the Financial Times warned that repeated strikes of this nature could raise transport costs and amplify volatility in already sensitive markets. For Ukraine, the message was strategic. A small number of precision weapons could inflict outsized economic harm. For NATO and the United States, now under an administration led by President Donald Trump, the attack reinforced a broader lesson. Modern warfare increasingly targets systems rather than armies' revenue streams rather than territory. As smoke continued to rise over the Black Sea, the question facing Moscow was no longer whether the port could be repaired, but how many similar vulnerabilities still remained undiscovered. And with that realization, attention shifted beyond the flames toward what this breach meant for the future balance of power. As daylight revealed the full extent of the damage at Novorossiysk, the strategic shockwaves began to spread far beyond the port itself. Satellite imagery analyzed by Western intelligence firms showed blackened craters where S-400 batteries once stood, scorched tank farms still smoldering, and large sections of port infrastructure offline. Russian officials moved quickly to control the narrative, emphasizing the number of drones intercepted and insisting that exports would resume. Yet, the images told a different story. A logistical artery had been severed, even if temporarily, and the cost would be measured not only in repairs, but in credibility. For Moscow, the strikes exposed a structural weakness in its defensive doctrine. The belief that distance and layered air defense could secure economic hubs was no longer tenable. Analysts at Jane's and Military Watch magazine noted that the operation did not rely on overwhelming force, but on sequencing blinding sensors exhausting interceptors, then striking high-value nodes. This approach mirrored concepts long discussed in NATO circles, now executed by Ukraine with limited resources. The implication was clear. Similar systems protecting energy terminals, refineries, and ports elsewhere along Russia's coastline could face comparable risks. From a NATO perspective, the attack carried dual significance. On one hand, it validated years of analysis about the vulnerability of static defenses to combined drone and cruise missile operations. On the other, it raised concerns about escalation and spillover. Novorossiysk is not only a Russian port, it is embedded in global trade routes. Any sustained disruption there affects insurers, shipping companies, and energy consumers well beyond the region. Western governments, including the United States under President Donald Trump, found themselves balancing strategic approval of Ukraine's effectiveness with caution over broader economic consequences. The strike also reshaped assumptions about deterrence. Russia's air defenses had served as a psychological barrier, reinforcing the idea that certain targets were off-limits. That barrier was now visibly breached. As Reuters reported in subsequent days, energy markets reacted not to the immediate loss of capacity, but to the precedent if a handful of missiles could neutralize such defenses, future attacks might follow. Insurance premiums for Black Sea shipping rose, and discussions intensified about alternative routes and contingency planning. Perhaps most significant was the message sent to all parties watching closely. Modern warfare, as demonstrated at Novorossiysk, rewards precision intelligence integration and economic targeting over sheer volume. Ukraine did not need hypersonic weapons or massed salvos. It needed understanding of radar physics, system behavior under stress, and the economic pressure points that matter most. As the fires were gradually brought under control and repair crews moved in, one question lingered over the Black Sea and beyond. Once a supposedly invulnerable fortress is proven vulnerable, how many others are still relying on the same assumptions? The strike on Novorossiysk marked a turning point in the conflict's strategic logic. Over the course of a single night, Ukraine demonstrated how a small number of precision weapons combined with drone saturation and careful sequencing could dismantle one of Russia's most heavily defended economic hubs. The operation unfolded methodically. Decoys overwhelmed air defense systems. Neptune missiles blinded S-400 radars, and follow-on strikes ignited critical oil infrastructure. The result was not just physical destruction, but economic disruption and reputational damage to Russia's defensive narrative. Looking ahead, Western analysts warn that this approach is likely to be repeated. Energy infrastructure ports and logistics nodes remain high-value targets, especially as Ukraine seeks to constrain Russia's war financing rather than pursue costly territorial advances. For NATO and the United States, the lesson is twofold. Modern air defenses are vulnerable under saturation, and economic warfare has become inseparable from military operations. The question now is not whether Novorossiysk will be repaired, but how quickly Russia can adapt its defenses and whether similar strikes will reshape the balance across the Black Sea. Could this signal a broader campaign against energy lifelines, or was this a singular demonstration of capability? If you want deeper analysis on how these shifts could redefine the war and NATO's role going forward, consider subscribing to the channel for upcoming reports and expert breakdowns.